Hey, Megan, Dr. G here at SPKN, the Sport Professional Knowledge Network. Today, we're thrilled to have three distinguished guests who have made significant contributions to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in coach development. First, let's welcome Dr. Robert Townsend, a senior lecturer at the University of Waikato in Hamilton, New Zealand. Robert's extensive research in disability and diversity in sport critically examines the barriers and pathways for underrepresented groups in coaching. Also joining us today is Dr. Andrew Bennie, Associate Professor in Health and Physical Education at Western Sydney University. Andrew's research focuses on creating culturally safe learning environments and developing strategies to enhance inclusivity in sport. And last but not least, we have Associate Professor of Physical Education and Sport at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England, Dr. Kate Russell. Kate is a researcher in the field of gender and sexuality in sport and educational contexts, as well as a sport and exercise psychologist. Together, these three have authored a chapter on advancing diversity and inclusion in coach development, which is featured in Taylor and Francis's new Routledge Handbook of Coach Developing in Sport. This chapter provides a comprehensive overview of the barriers and challenges faced by diverse groups in coaching. Their work not only sheds light on the current state of diversity in sport, but also offers actionable pathways and initiatives to promote inclusivity. Robert, Andrew, Kate, welcome to SPKN.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, just right. The first kind of easy question too to all of y'all, and we can start perhaps with Kate. Just what got you into this work? What was your interest and background experiences that led you to pursue this as a research area?
I've always been involved in sport my whole of my life, and then when I did my undergrad, sport was probably the most significant part of my university career, as much as I can remember. But my PhD was in women's participation in rugby, cricket, and netball, and that just really led me to this really close awareness about the different experiences that women in particular could have in different types of sport, based on the sort of social and cultural kind of dynamics of those different sporting spaces, and in particular interested about how that affected their identity development and body satisfaction. So right from my kind of earliest sort of academic inroads, this has always been a really kind of important area for me. And I'm just really intrigued by the sort of intersections between people's individual identities, the sporting context that they choose to play or work in, and how that might affect their experiences, really. So that's where my work kind of begins.
Yeah. Rob or Andrew, you want to jump in?
Look, I'm probably not too different to Kate in that regard. I've always had a passion for sport, grew up playing a lot of sports, then studied sport at university and undergrad and postgrad level. The connection really with advancing sort of social justice matters and First Nations contexts came about as a result of more an absence of knowledge from my high schooling. We didn't really learn much about First Nations culture and history from their perspective. It was always spun from a kind of colonial view. So I started on a bit of a personal journey to find out more just about our history here in Australia. And through sport, started volunteering with my twin brother and a very good friend who I studied with in a National Aboriginal Sporting Chance program. And then by way of studying and teaching as a postgrad, got involved in some tutoring, and naturally, as things evolved with my interest in sports coaching, I managed to sort of marry up this personal interest in learning more about First Nations culture in Australia and sports coaching, which is where we started off our project trying to understand the experience of First Nations coaches and their pathways into coaching. So it all sort of came about as a result of that. And probably the last 10 or so years I've dedicated to exploring and deepening my understanding of that in the world of academia and in the sports industry.
Yeah, I think mine's really similar to Andrew in that I experienced a very obvious and jarring absence of knowledge. So prior to any kind of after my master's, prior to my PhD, I was on a trajectory to try and become a professional coach, and I was undertaking all sorts of apprenticeships and internships and stuff within professional sport. And one of those experiences was go and lead some disability sessions down at your local cricket club. And so I went down. The senior coach, who was supposed to be my mentor and the lead coach in that session, didn't turn up. And then, a group of young people turned up with various impairments ranging in levels of severity. And I was terrified. I didn't know what I was doing, felt completely out of my depth. And I had to coach for 2 weeks. And the drop off between week 1 and week 2 was significant enough for me to be like, okay, clearly there is not a good experience here for these young people. And that's on me. It's not on them. It's not on their motivations. It's not on their abilities. It's the fact that they've got a coach who is really out of their depth and doesn't know what he's doing. And that actually put me off from coaching in disability sport for a while, for 2 or 3 years, before I kind of rolled back into my PhD and aligned that with disability sport, because I kind of figured that throughout my education journey, I'd never been exposed to disability. I'd done little bits in special educational needs schools in the UK, but only little bits, not prolonged exposure. And we never learned anything about disability or how to develop pedagogical responses to disabled people in sport. And so, yeah, my interest in disability comes from the fact that often in coach education, we never talk to coaches about disability, about impairment, and how to be more inclusive in their practice, and that there must be a different or better way to upskill coaches on inclusion. And I guess that's how I ended up where I'm at now.
Just to follow up on this thread then too, Ray, what do you guys think about when you were coming up? Why did that absence, or did this lack of attention to this issue exist? And does it still exist today?
In disability, it definitely still exists. And that's, part of my research program is to try and address that and move. I've written a paper on infusion, trying to infuse ideas about disability into mainstream, in air quotes, coach education, because if you continue to position disability or any form of difference as like an add-on course or extra or separate from coach education, often coaches will have a choice between engaging with that or not. And the default is to not engage with that. And it's a long-standing issue in coaching, particularly in disability. I'm not sure what that looks like in terms of Andrew and Kate's areas.
Yeah, it's quite similar. I think about a national sports accreditation at the moment, where I won't name the organization, but their coach accreditation and training does exactly that. So they're trying hard to be more inclusive and include diverse perspectives in their accreditation, but the community-based entry-level and second-level coaching accreditations, in fact, all of the ones that you can traverse through in this sport, have the add-on of a cultural competency model. So it's not weaving in understanding of diversity, inclusion, different minority groups within the mainstream coach education that people take across the entire nation. So, yeah, my sense is that a lot of people would opt out, and the people that opt in are probably, of a First Nations background, for instance.
And I think for gender more broadly, and then sort of gender diverse people specifically, I think there's a similar sort of dynamic, that there is an increase in terms of providing awareness training for working with those sorts of populations, but definitely not so much about if you happen to belong to one of those groups, in particular for if you were trans or non-binary or something kind of like that. And given sports context at the moment, and certainly kind of in the UK, everybody just panicking about everything, and the worry about being identified in that particular way, in particular, and I think it does depend on the type of sport that you're playing and who your participants are. That if you do identify as part of the LGBTQ community anyway, that has the potential for some worries and concerns. But there's not really anything, or there's very little out there at the moment, in particular for LGBTQ coaches, to in terms of their training and how they might manage going out and kind of like working with younger players or parents in particular. The kids will be fine, it's generally the parents that will have some sort of concerns about that kind of scenario. So there's definitely inroads in terms of wanting to provide some awareness kind of training, but there's also this kind of difference between, is it about people that you're going to be working with rather than about you as the actual coach, I think.
Maybe we should go back a little bit and explain the difference between inclusion, diversity, equity, equality in the context of sport coaching. You know, how do these concepts intersect in your research once we define them? We always like to define the terms.
No, it's good. We were joking about this as a research team because we were like, if we set this for our students, then I'm sure that we would probably fail that same assignment. So, I mean, these terms obviously differ quite significantly based on the researchers that use them and the backgrounds that they come from. I think early on in our chapter, we were kind of aligned with, we wanted to draw on a social justice and human rights perspective in informing concepts like equality and equity. And so for us, equality and equity are about having access to sport and being able to realize those fundamental human rights of being able to be active and have a range of choices. Equity is the recognition that some groups face further barriers to realizing those rights than others, and therefore requires deliberate and targeted efforts to be able to achieve that level of equality. So there's the slight distinction between equity and equality, which I probably just butchered. But inclusion itself, I mean, I kind of wrestle with inclusion as a topic in my disability work quite a lot. And it's really hard to find consensus and definitions of inclusion. And lots of people write about it, but not many people define it. And so in our chapter, we take two contrasting perspectives. One's a really simple one in terms of inclusion is just a general absence of exclusion. Seems quite broad and quite vague, but what it means is that to be inclusive is to challenge discriminatory processes, discriminatory practices, policies, and systems which might actually reduce opportunities for different groups and individuals. But there's also an individual level of inclusion, which people are starting to write about a little bit more. And for us, inclusion was about the different groups that we work with and research with feeling connected and feeling like they belong and feeling like they're visible within different sporting spaces and places and situations. So for us, the inclusion is the interesting point because it's a dual focus. And in my own work in disability, I guess I'd never really connected my disability research with broader notions of diversity, equity. But I suppose any disability work is based within an equity paradigm because you are having to address structural disadvantage. You are having to address inequalities, and you're having to develop strategies that can target and dismantle those systems of power that are reducing opportunities for disabled people.
Maybe Kate and Andrew would like to grade you on your answer.
It's A+.
I've missed diversity, haven't I? I've missed diversity.
So sounds like great inflation to me.
Yeah, and I suppose for us in the chapter as well, when we think about diversity, we're thinking about including those groups that are typically missing from sport. So, you know, sport is seen as the last white male straight preserve, and so there are groups of people and individuals that are disadvantaged by that. And so for us, diversity is recognizing that sport should be and is for everyone, and is embracing and welcoming of those different diverse perspectives, whether it's different backgrounds, socioeconomic classes, genders, orientations, ethnicities, and abilities.
So then what would some effective strategies based on your research that sport organizations can implement to improve diversity and inclusion?
I can jump in first with that one if you like, and speak to some of the experiences I've had working alongside First Nations coaches. So we started out with a couple of years of background research trying to understand that pathway into coaching and experience when in coaching from a First Nations point of view. And most of them talked about gaining an initial experience in coaching within First Nations programming. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In Australia, we have a rugby foundation called the Lloyd McDermott Rugby Program, and that is specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people to go and participate in a national rugby carnival. and the people that coach in there are often First Nations coaches. Likewise, we have a really significant Koori Knockout, which is a rugby league tournament within New South Wales, one of the states or provinces here in Australia, and there'll be 80 teams in open ages and junior ages competing in rugby league. They're all from First Nations communities, and a lot of the people that go and coach there are people who identify as First Nations. And so you could say the same across other sports contexts. And what draws them to these contexts is that not only are they initially giving back to their community, which is a very significant and important cultural component of how they are, but it's also that opportunity to try and connect with and strengthen cultural identity while at these programs, at the same time as being a safer place for them to gain experience in coaching, see what they think about it, give back to their sport. So certainly one of the things that coaches mentioned a lot in the research that we undertook when we spoke to a variety of First Nations coaches from different sports across Australia was that getting into some sort of First Nations programming helped and made them feel safe when they were coaching. So for me, that's something that's really significant and part of the reason why we set up the Coaching Unlimited program, because the coaches in our research recommended that the absence of opportunities to enter the coaching pathway in the accreditation system and progress up that pathway were significant, and that the current environments, many people didn't feel safe in going and taking a mainstream course in a general population setting. It's just highly intimidating, and they'd often be the only one there. So setting up something like that was recommended, and it's what we ended up doing. But I'll talk to that a little bit later on.
In relation to the, I guess, gender, so it's similar, I think, in some contexts to what Andrew was just talking there. It's about really like the visibility and the representation of the people within that particular community that it seems to be the most important. So there's some sort of co-creation work, about the understanding of what the issues might actually be in the first place, rather than that sort of being imposed or assumed by others about the particular challenges that might come up for that particular group. And really about reflecting the lived experiences of those coaches who might identify as LGBTQ in particular. And I mean, there are a couple of organizations who have explicitly included those lived experiences as kind of like examples in coach education systems. So the Outsports kind of toolkit, which was actually a European-based program, has that kind of explicitly identified and included as part of the learning process then for all coaches. But, you know, there's a representation there of queer kind of coaches being used as kind of scenario settings. And then in Canada as well, the Leading the Way program, which seems to be really advanced. Canada seems to be doing a great job about these things as well, that there's a kind of an explicit acknowledgement of the diversity of the coaches in terms of gender identity. That seems to be quite important too. So for me, it's just really about being able to kind of see yourself potentially in either those who are actually educating you to become the coach, or at least having those sorts of conversations when you're talking about that coach development. So there's a recognition that you as this particular person can feel safe. So again, connecting to what Andrew was saying, like a safe space to sort of do some of that learning processes in the first place, and an acknowledgement of your identity and an awareness that it might give you particular types of challenges. And I just think having some of those, what might be potentially difficult conversations as part of your learning about being the coach would be really, really important. I mean, I've certainly seen that in my other contexts around training to teach. So in a similar kind of way, if you're like becoming a coach, having those conversations and not being afraid to kind of actually like name the word and kind of explore that in different dynamics, and having representation by others, you know, and having those lived experiences shares, I think are always really valuable. So that's what my sense of that would be.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Andrew and Kate have just said resonate across disability. It's a quicker answer for me because there's very little happening in the disability space internationally that is designed to improve pathways for disabled people into sport. Often, you know, disability training to improve participant experiences is often based on really reductive training packages, like half-day workshops on how to be inclusive, how to modify your existing practices, and I'm quite critical of those approaches. But I think not to I don't want to repeat anything that Kate and Andrew have said, but I think for me there's also a reflection from NSOs, national governing bodies, national sports organizations, on when we think about who is a coach, what do we see and what do we think about? And often there's a hierarchy of abilities. There's a default position of man with a clipboard maybe and a whistle. And so how do we start to shift that mindset? How do we start to shift that picture of who is a coach and who belongs in sports settings and who belongs in those leadership positions? And in the case of disability, we often see a real absence of both disabled coach developers from which to learn about and learn from about disability. And we see a real absence of disabled coaches working with athletes, working not just in the disability space, but with able-bodied athletes. So there's a lot of work to be done in my area in particular around shifting that and valuing knowledge rather than physical ability within coaching contexts.
I think I could extend on that as well, just in terms of valuing the knowledge. So if I think back to our background work before we spoke with First Nations coaches, we sort of were looking at some of the professional sports contexts here in Australia, the National Rugby League and Australian Football League. They both have a very high level of representation of First Nations athletes. So we know that a trend over time has to sort of been to imagine First Nations athletes as having this innate, natural and magical talent that's led them to get to the top of their game, as opposed to working really hard, practicing every day and training alongside other people to get to the top of their sport. But there's an overrepresentation in the athletes. There's a small population here, about 3% of the total population is First Nations, but in these two professional sports, it's around 10%. So they're overrepresented in playing. And what we know about professional sports context is that often people get tapped on the shoulder to become the next assistant coach or head coach of those teams. But that's just not happening with the First Nations coaches. So it's not valuing their knowledge. It's not viewing them as leaders. And as a result, there are no head coaches in any professional sports league that identify as First Nations people. So if you think about being able to see people in those positions and imagine yourself there as a young person, it's just not happening. And most of the programming tends to happen in an athlete talent pathway for First Nations people, or connecting First Nations people to education and employment outcomes in terms of programming connected to sport as well. So that absence also creates that or reinforces a picture of invisibility, where people are just ignored, even though they might have the capability, the talent, the want, the interest in becoming a coach. And it speaks to what Rob was saying about the image of who are the coaches at the moment. And I think there just needs to probably be a little bit more energy and effort from sport organizations to recognize and value the talent, the capability, and also the number of people that are volunteering out there, particularly at the community level, that might not be a part of their imagination for progression up a coaching talent pathway. And that's part of what we're trying to address through our Coaching Unlimited program. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit, as potentially weaving into one of the barriers that First Nations coaches in particular face at all levels of sport, even if they have aspiration to work their way into and then up the coaching pathway.
Yeah, do y'all think anybody's doing an outstanding job of trying to diversify and be more inclusive as well? You know, in a kind of mainstream dominant system, right? Is there anybody that's kind of really destabilizing their structures? And, you know, it's not lost on me, you know, looking on the screen here, that we all appear to be white folks too. So, you know, is there anybody that's actually doing the work at the top that tends to be, again, you know, white, male centric, sort of heterosexual? Do y'all have any examples of that? I mean, we've talked about some affinity groups or specialized groups like Outsports and others. Is there anybody in the main then that's doing we might say a better job, or doing some good initiatives?
I think I can jump in. I mean, I've just taken on a role with with Sport New Zealand, I'll be the new national disability lead, and one of the priority areas of that role in New Zealand is to advocate within the mainstream sports sector to ensure that disability isn't left to disability sport organisations. So in that sense, here in New Zealand, there's a lot of policy efforts being directed towards recognising diversity, women and girls, Māori and Pacifica, and disability. But there's just that lack of follow through at the ground level. Like, how do we actually bring this to life? How do we actually ensure that those groups are being represented?
There's initiatives. Progress is slow. I mean, sports organisations are trying, but progress is very, very slow. And that's probably what's most evident from a coaching point of view as well. I mean, the bottom line for many sports organisations is athletic participation. So there's a will from sports organisations. Some have more economic power, and as a result are able to progress a little bit faster and probably show some initiative. But for example, when we did our desktop analysis of whether any First Nations coaching pathways existed, there was only one national sports organisation out of 60 odd in Australia that actually had a coaching pathway. So whereas before I was talking about these athlete development pathways, you know, probably 15 to 20 of them exist, but there was one for coaching. So it's a step-by-step thing, I think, for organizations. And there's a lot of bureaucracy and planning and time that takes place to co-develop these things in the right way and make them sustainable and long-term, and not just all shiny and new and for the sake of a marketing experience. But there isn't really a standout, because wherever there's something good being done, then something terrible happens that takes away from that progress, like incidents of racism that get publicized in the media and blown up in these sports that are so-called further ahead with their connection or have higher population bases of First Nations players. So there's been a very interesting incline in participation in AFL, particularly at all levels, but at the highest level. And now it's dropping off at the professional level because of ongoing instances of racism. So when you think about broader societal barriers like that just keep popping up in sports where some initiative is taking place, it just pulls them back, I think, a little bit. So it's tricky work, but until we get that better understanding across society of the First Nations experience, lived experiences, progress will continue to be slow, unfortunately.
So there's an opportunity, I think, within the mainstream sports sector to work with NSOs to help improve their institutional memory, their institutional capacity for inclusion, and not just leaving disability to the responsibility of disability sport organizations, like ensuring there's greater integration between those. So it's more of a structural opportunity or an organizational opportunity at that level. Internationally, I can't think of too many programs that would be a flagship or, best practice in terms of disability inclusion. There's some good stuff being done by a colleague of mine, Tabo Huntley, across the European Union, where he's developed a para-coaching coach education framework, which is designed to slot into existing qualification frameworks for coaches. And there's some research ongoing here in New Zealand around trying to infuse ideas about disability into mainstream accreditation, and understanding, like, what are the pedagogical challenges of that? What does it actually look like to infuse ideas? And who do we need to actually engage with, as Andrew said, in that kind of co-produced participatory process to do that?
And for me, in terms of, I guess, gender diversity, again, nothing that really kind of stands out, but I guess what we're hearing about is more like sort of individual stories where the individual coach has found their place, and they have that particular role, and they've generally been really well supported by the players. So we have a recent, actually it's quite a local club to me here. It's not an elite level. This is for football, soccer. Where he was a player manager who came out as gay to his teammates at the time, and then he's gone on to now become like the coach stroke manager of that. And that's the first time that's been a visible person coaching a male football team in that particular way. So there are incidences like that where, when there's been something that's happened, that actually it's been in a safe space for them, and the players have been really responsive and positive. I think in women's football, in particular in the UK, and I think in the States too, that gay women certainly can feel like there is a place for them in those spaces, and there's definitely kind of, I guess, less resistance or concern about that than, say, if it was a male person identifying as gay, or in particular a trans person. I can't think of any examples of a trans person coaching at a kind of like a reasonably like high level coaching. So I think it depends a lot, I think, for gender identity, about what's the sport and who is the person that is being the coach in that particular space. And there are definitely more, I guess we might call them more like legitimate types of bodies, in particular legitimate types of sports, that where they link up together, there's kind of less worry about that process. And I think gay women in particular, there are certainly gay women are overrepresented in any of the data that we kind of have. They're kind of like over-researched, really. We know much more about them, and we know very little about kind of trans or non-binary kind of coaches. So and while there is those organizations, as I said, that are really deliberately choosing to create stories and narratives around LGBTQ coaches, I don't think there's any specific pathway for anybody to kind of go through that kind of says, I'm going to work with you as you work your way up through the kind of the coaching development kind of scale. So not at the minute, no.
Is there an obvious next step that that we as a global community in sport can make, that would make an obvious kind of progression? And if so, how do you measure that kind of progress? Are there indicators you'd recommend to use?
Yeah, it's actually that we actually take an anti-indicator stance in the chapter that we wrote, where we recognize there's a need to value and centralize diversity and inclusion within sports organizations, but there's a danger that as soon as you start putting metrics on it and targets and KPIs, that they can be used as a yardstick to beat people with. And also there's a danger that once you say, oh, let's say we need to develop a pathway for LGBT plus coaches, and we need to get a cohort of 15 going through that in the first year. If you tick that box, there's a danger that you can just sit on your laurels and say, yep, we fixed it. And actually, you haven't fixed it, because there's still an overly masculine, overly ableist, overly white culture within the sport that requires a lot more deliberate effort to fix. And so in the chapter, we engage with some work from Sarah Ahmed, who writes about the need to address those systems of power within governing bodies. And while you need diversity, equity, and inclusion champions and people who can support work across organizations, there's also a danger that often DEI gets left to those individuals who are often from those minority groups. So you might have a disability and inclusion person in your governing body who is disabled themselves, and then you can wash your hands of it and say, yeah, we've addressed disability because we've got this person in a role. So it's much more of a less of an organizational shift and more of a valuing of that type of knowledge, and a centralizing of that type of knowledge across the organization. We do talk about equity training and diversity training within the chapter. And again, coaches can receive that in different ways. Like sometimes they can feel, particularly coaches from really privileged groups or dominant groups, can feel like there's blame on themselves for being exclusive without doing anything, or at least for to blame for occupying those privileged subject positions. But at the same time, those kind of training and educational courses are quite useful in raising awareness of the barriers that different groups face. So again, one of our arguments is, well, how do you, rather than have a standalone DEI course, how do you actually infuse those ideas throughout your general preparation process for coaches, from your neophyte level ones through to your master coaches? So yeah, there's a lot of work to do, I think. But I'd say that maybe Andrew and Kate agree or disagree, but my feeling is you probably wouldn't want to put indicators on, because there's a danger that you can then wash your hands of the process.
A lot of times I've said that it's not a to do, it's a to be. And so a lot of times, you're looking to make those check marks, and that's not really what it's about.
Yeah, and I would certainly say that I think we all kind of agree on this sense of that compliance is in and of itself is really kind of challenging, because I think that becomes really quite a passive process, but actually disrupting the settings can be more powerful. So exploring around like the values that you want to have in your kind of organization and framing it from, our perspective was really starting from that social justice perspective as well, and looking at kind of what is the culture that you want to be kind of generating. I mean, we see that in sport across loads of things. I did a lot of work around child protection in sport a long time ago, where there was a real resistance to, oh my God, do we have to kind of look after our kids now, sort of thing? Why can't we just shout and get them to do whatever we want and not worry about them? And that took a lot of work to really kind of shift that kind of sort of cultural perspective about what is it that we want our sport places to be like, and who do we want to be running our sport groups and all that kind of stuff. So I think our ability to create a space where we can be disruptive and just keep asking really difficult questions, and not just being pushed aside when somebody kind of goes, well, don't worry, I've done the training, as if therefore that means, like you were just saying there, Meg, I really love that, and I use that kind of idea quite a lot about, I'm trying to think of the exact word, but being mindful of the work that you're actually doing, rather than just doing this bit now where you're going to take something off the shelf and kind of go, there we go, there's my diversity training for today, well done, thank you very much. And then once that's over, you put that back on the shelf and you just carry on with what you're doing kind of normally, rather than actually embodying those kind of key principles. So I think there's opportunities to do that type of work, but that takes a big commitment from the organization as well as the people who really want to drive it to say. And I think Rob's point there was really important about, if it becomes the one queer person in your club to kind of try and keep forcing all of those changes kind of through, then there's all of that additional load laid onto them. And it's kind of like, it's not just my job to do this. You're a human being too. We're all part of this humanness. So step up and own it as well. And so, yeah, just about that kind of getting a bit annoyed and fed up and sort of demanding a bit of change, I think is important as well.